attributed to individuals for the purpose of protecting certain vital interests, such as the interest in being able to practice one's religion or to associate it with whoever one wants, with whomever one wants. Fundamental rights are claims that a government is obliged to respect even if a democratic majority seeks to deny them. Group differentiated rights are granted not to individuals but to groups and must be exercised collectively by the group rather than by individuals as such. Kimlicker's innovation is to argue that such rights are sometimes necessary to protect vital individual interests. Now we move on to page number 250. The mere fact that people have an interest in cultural membership does not suffice to justify any special rights. The second stage of Kimlicker's argument tries to establish that there are indeed special rights of protection supported by this interest, and that when they conflict with the standard liberal rights, they sometimes take precedence. Liberals standardly assume that the interests of each member of the community matter equally. When all citizens participate in a common culture, this assumption is compatible with the use of markets and democratic procedures, but small cultural communities can be outbid in markets and outvoted in majoritarian democracies on matters that are crucial to their survival as a cultural community. They can be outbid in markets because there are important economies of scale attached to the production of mass culture, and because there are powerful incentives for creators of culture to aim for large audiences. So, a Hollywood movie may cost US dollar 100 million to make, quite apart from distribution costs. It would be simply implausible that such a movie made in Slovenian or Welsh would make back its cost, because only a handful of Slovenian or Welsh speakers would watch it. And this inequality is rooted in the given circumstances of the members of the different communities. The Welsh did not choose to be Welsh in a society in which Welsh is a minority culture, so they should not be presumed to be responsible for their vulnerability to the choices of others. The asymmetry of vulnerability between the minority and majority cultures justifies considering measures that will protect the minority culture, and group differentiated rights can constitute such measures. It is worth noting what the argument does not claim. In later work, Kimlicker draws a distinction between external protections and internal restrictions. So here is what is quoted. Liberals can and should endorse certain external protections where they promote fairness between groups, but should reject internal restrictions which limit the right of group members to question and revise traditional authorities and practices. Now moving on. Internal restrictions are attempts to limit the ability of members of the group to express their own conceptions of the good or to influence the direction of the culture itself. For example, the suppression of the religious practices of minorities within the protected group. Now there is a box given first, so I'll read it out. So the box is key text 11.1, subheading being Kimlicker Multicultural Citizenship in bracket 1995. This text builds on the arguments for group differentiated rights that Kimlicka made in his first book and demonstrates their importance for practical policy. The book argues, contrary to what had been the mainstream liberal view, that minority rights of various kinds are consistent both with core liberal democratic commitments and with many existing liberal democratic constitutions. At the same time, it argues that because the situations of minorities differ according to context, there is no single right approach to granting rights, although it does endorse a core constraint that freedom of speech, thought, and conscience of individual members of minorities should be protected. It has been translated into 14 languages, including Catalan, Ukrainian, Serbian, and Croatian. Now we move on to page number 251. External protections are attempts to prevent outsiders from influencing the direction of the culture. For example, subsidies for the arts within the culture, or legal requirements preventing sales of land or homes to incomers who have no connection with the community. Kimlicka does not argue for complete self-government or secession of the minorities with which he is concerned. He argues for some group differentiated rights that would enable members of the group collectively to protect their cultural heritage from outsiders, but not to prevent insiders from influencing it. An obvious objection is that even external protections may sometimes conflict with the basic liberties to which, according to a rough consensus, all citizens have a right as a matter of justice. Restricting rights of outsiders to reside in a territory involves limiting the rights of insiders to sell or rent their property to outsiders. Protecting a minority language by requiring that it be spoken in the public arena or by limiting access to translation in that arena limits the rights of insiders who wish to abandon that language to self expression. But when group differentiated rights and basic liberties conflict, which should give way? Kimlicka, in fact, has a rather simple answer. He does not have to say that group differentiated rights should always have priority, only that it is not obvious that they should always give way. If he is right that both sets of rights have their justification in the same fundamental interest, protection of the individual's ability rationally to reflect on and to revise his or her conception of the good life, then prima facie, at least they have equal status. There is, however, a deeper problem which concerns the very distinction between internal restrictions and external protections. Our ability to revise our practices and question authority depends crucially on what other opportunities are available to us. If I have a realistic opinion or if I have a realistic option of exiting culture A to culture B, that not only sets up another option for me outside culture A, but it also generally sets up for me a more diverse range of options within culture A. In this case, the traditional authorities have more incentive to bend to my demands for revision in order to keep me within culture A. Now, this page has a box, which is box 11.1, the subheading being Native Land Rights in Australia. In 1992, a decision by High Court of Australia in the case of Mabo v Queensland, in the bracket number 2 or NO2. So I'll spell out the name of the case, which is MABO, Mabo, then V, then Queensland, concerned the legal rights of the Meriam people to the lands of the Murray Islands in the Torres Strait. The court held that the common law of Australia recognizes a form of native title to be determined in accordance with indigenous traditional law and custom. It thus rejected the notion that Australia was terra nullius, which is spelled as TERRANULLIUS, that is, land belonging to no one at the time of British settlement. In 1993, the Native Title Act established a framework for the protection and recognition of native title, under which, number 1, the rights and interests are possessed under traditional laws and customs that continue to be acknowledged and observed by the relevant Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. Number 2, by virtue of those laws and customs, the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders have a connection with the land or waters. And number 3, native title rights and interests are recognized by the common law of Australia. Now we move on to page number 252. The degree of permeability of boundaries between cultures affects what goes on within them, including the extent to which members of cultures can be restricted. So Kimlicka's distinction is compromised. If the interest in having conditions in which we can exercise our capacity rationally to reconsider and revise our conception of the good supports an interest in cultural membership, it also supports an interest in having permeable boundaries between our culture and other cultures. But the permeability of boundaries will predictably be limited by many special rights, in particular by language rights. If, for example, special group language rights lead to more children growing up as monolingual speakers of the minority language, especially if the minority culture is itself illiberal, this limits their opportunities for exit and thus their ability to reshape their home culture in their own interests. Now, there is a box with the heading key points. So, point number 1, some of the rights of citizenship belong to groups. Number 2, instituting group differentiated rights will affect the relationships between groups, but also within groups. And point number 3, group differentiated rights are liable to empower the already powerful within illiberal groups. Now, we move on to the next topic, which is the boundaries of citizenship. We have explored the idea of citizenship so far without asking who gets to be a citizen. Again, As with the rights and duties of citizenship, we need to distinguish descriptive from normative accounts. Just as different polities grant citizens different rights and duties, so they make different rules about who gets to be a citizen. The USA grants citizenship automatically to anyone born within its boundaries, regardless of the citizenship or immigration status of his or her parents. It has a complex set of rules about who can become a naturalized citizen, including a lottery for applicants to the status that precedes citizenship, bracket lawful permanent resident status or green card holder, bracket close, which is weighted toward people from particular other countries and with particular skills. Most other liberal democracies are less generous to foreigners in their rules. Until recently, it was extremely difficult to become a German citizen, even if one was born in Germany, but yet easy even if one was not, if one parent was a German citizen. The ability of countries to restrict the benefits that come with citizenship at will is usually taken for granted in political debates, and understandably so. Democratically elected politicians have special responsibilities to those who have elected them, which categories are likely to include non citizens. But it should not be taken for granted. The borders of modern nations have not been established through some morally innocent process, but are to a significant extent the upshot of war and negotiation among uncountable elites. We move on to next page number, which is 253. This would not be so problematic if citizenship of any country brought with it equally good benefits as citizenship of any other, but that is not so true. Wealthy countries not only enjoy greater material prosperity to the benefits of which the citizens have access, but they also enjoy higher levels of stability and social peace. The arbitrary boundaries of nation states distribute various important goods radically unequally. This does not necessarily mean that citizenship should be available to whoever wants it, but it does mean that practices and policies concerning the conference of citizenship need normative justification. Defenders of exclusionary practices have to explain why governments doing the excluding legitimately have the power to determine who should have access to the territory they govern. One helpful way of thinking about this is to assume that moral arbitrariness of the assignment of citizenship supports an open immigration policy, one that allows anyone to switch residence and citizenship at will, and then to ask what reasons there could be for restricting immigration. Here are three common reasons, followed by some discussion. Number one, it is often exclaimed that compatriots have special obligations to one another that do not extend to others, and that restricting immigration enables them to deliver on these obligations. Theorists differ in what these obligations are and how weighty they are relative to the obligation that citizens have to foreign strangers. At the limit is the view that there are no duties to foreign strangers at all, but most theorists recognize some obligations which may in fact be stringent, but which fall short of what we must do for our compatriots. Now, in bracket, see Miller 1995, Miller 1998 for quite different version of this view. In this bracket close, in this view, national membership should be the main determinant of citizenship, with the qualification that nations have the prerogative collectively to admit others and the condition that they fulfill their lesser obligations to foreign strangers. The difficulty with this position is that there needs to be some underlying reason why it is that people have special obligations to their compatriots. Different reasons are offered in literature, but all of them have the problem that the relationship of compatriot is morally arbitrary. I'll just spell this word COMPATRIOT. To justify special partiality to compatriots, it has to be shown that having that relationship helps to produce some very important good that can be produced in no other way. Number two, it is sometimes claimed that immigration must be limited by the need to maintain stable political arrangements and or a stable public culture. Sudden mass immigration into some stable democracies might well disrupt the sense of social solidarity that is the key to production of certain political and cultural goods, either by provoking resentment in the indigenous population or by introducing too many new citizens who lack the values and traits necessary to produce those goods. This approach might have a great deal of weight in some circumstances, but it is worth thinking about what those circumstances are. Suppose that a small but stable and wealthy country were to open its borders unilaterally and suddenly, then it could expect dramatic immigration that may well undermine its stability. But if all wealthy countries were to open their borders in a phased way over a period of, for example, several generations, the effect of immigration might well be much more manageable. We move on to next page number, which is 254. Still, there might be shocks, especially to countries that are geographically proximate to other countries that experience sudden traumas, resulting in large-scale migration. Furthermore, a worldwide regime of open borders would alter the incentives in relation both to ethnic cleansing within borders and responses to one country's ethnic cleansing from others, and in ways that are not easy to calculate. Now, number three. The third reason is related but most self consciously pragmatic. A world government, a non nation state, is impractical. So, the least evil system of international relationships is grounded in a system of nation states. For that system to function, states must have effective control over membership. This position has considerable plausibility. We do not now have a workable alternative to a system of nations, and it is fair to assume that countries will inevitably exercise some control over membership. The fact that closed borders are relatively new is no counterexample to this. In earlier times, countries exercised de facto control even in the face of open borders, because long distance travel and communication were far more scarce and costly than they are now. While a good pragmatic consideration, it provides no guidance for particular policymakers in particular countries who are deciding how open their border should be. While they acknowledge that, as a general matter, it is impractical to expect that all borders will be open, they cannot use that fact to oppose specific attempts to open up specific borders to specific people. Now, there is a box of key points. Number one, for most of the history of states, borders were open, but travel was costly and difficult. Number two, three kinds of reasons frequently advanced to limit immigration, reasons distinguishing our obligations to compatriots from those to foreigners. The assumption that large scale immigration destabilizes local institutions, and the pragmatic need for manageable institutions to have clear boundaries. Number three, the last of these reasons is the most persuasive. Now we move on to next topic, creating citizens. Citizens are made, not born. They are made both in the sense that birth does not automatically confer citizenship, and in the sense that responsible enjoyment of the rights and exercise of the duties of citizenship is not natural, but demands traits that are learned in the process of education and upbringing. Even in a relatively unambitious view of the duties of citizenship, it cannot simply be assumed that everyone will grow up to exercise those responsibilities effectively and responsibly. Suppose more ambitiously that citizens are morally bound by the norm of reciprocity. Then they have to learn how to bracket some of their most fundamental and moral convictions when engaging in political debate, leading to the exercise of political power. This is not a trivial ability and is one that must be learned and then constantly practiced. We move on to page number 255. Uh, there is a box 11.2 with the subheading being different approaches to citizenship education. Democratic countries vary a great deal in how they approach citizenship education in schools. Until recently, the UK, for example, had no explicit reference to citizenship in its national curriculum, and whereas the government could at one time rely on schools to inculcate in children pride in the empire and in being British, there was a long period during which most schools neither did that nor consciously educated children to be effective citizens. The USA has no national curriculum and control of schools, and what gets taught in them is very localized. There is nevertheless an almost pervasive assumption that the social studies curriculum should be designed in part to inculcate patriotic loyalty and a sense of national identity. But this does not extend as far as cohesive view about what the duties of citizenship are or that schools should educate from them. By contrast, France has a very elaborate national curriculum for citizenship education, which leans on a rich and demanding conception of citizenship that is not unlike that of Gutman and Thompson, and which there is every reason to believe is enacted in the schools. Now we move on with the text. Is it legitimate then to require schools to teach children to become good citizens? And if so, are there any limits on what schools may do to promote citizenship? It might seem straightforward that whatever the right conception of good citizenship is, government should require it to be taught in schools, but it is not straightforward. The introduction of citizenship education to the UK national curriculum met with some opposition, and it is worth focusing on that opposition to eliminate the more general issue. The first objection worth considering is that citizenship education requires a large pool of teachers who are well equipped to teach relevant habits, information, and skills. Even the principles of statistical analysis are difficult to teach, and both the USA and the UK face severe shortages of qualified mathematics teachers. Now we have a box, key text 11.2. The subheading is the Crick Report. In 1997, Professor Bernard Crick was charged with heading up an advisory committee to develop recommendations concerning the introduction of citizenship education into the national curriculum of England and Wales. Crick's committee recommended that citizenship be taught as a compulsory subject as at secondary bracket ages 11 to 16 bracket close level, but that it not be subject to compulsory examinations. The recommendations were adopted without much change or debate. The report bracket advisory on citizenship 1998 bracket close is available online at www.qca.org.uk/download/612 underscore crick underscore report underscore 1998.pdf. Now we move on with the reading. So moving on to page number 256. But the teacher of citizenship education would not only need a good grounding in statistics but also in a wide range of other subjects such as history, political theory, and economics. Teaching children how to reason and argue reasonably about contentious and emotionally charged issues may be even more difficult. Teachers will naturally be nervous about the sensitivities of the students and about forces outside the classroom that are ready to pounce if they exceed their limit. Some parents will fear that their children are being indoctrinated. Others will fear that their children are not being sufficiently challenged, but are merely having the prejudice confirmed. In a heterogeneous classroom, it will be hard to avoid feeling at least one of these fears. Consider now a second objection. The authorities designing the curricular demands and the teachers themselves must be conscious of the possibility of political bias in their teaching and must be well equipped to avoid bias. James Tooley, a trenchant critic of the introduction of citizenship education in the UK, saw bias built into the aims of the report recommending it. Now there are two boxes on this page. The first box is box 11.3 with the subheading The National Curriculum for Citizenship Education in England and Wales. The national curriculum suggests that primary schools should aim to cover knowledge, understanding, and skills that prepare pupils to play an active role as citizens. This promotes pupils' personal and social development, including health and well-being. Secondary schools should aim to reflect the need to ensure that pupils have a clear understanding of their roles, rights, and responsibilities in relation to their local, national, and international communities. The three strands in the programs of study to be taught are: number 1, knowledge and understanding about becoming an informed citizen. Number 2, developing skills of inquiry and communication. And number 3, developing skills of participation and responsible action. Moving on to the next box, which is box 11.4 with the subheading Tooley on the Crick Report. It is pretty easy to spot a tad of political bias creeping into the bracket Crick report at every stage. After all, ethical trading, peacemaking and peacekeeping, and poverty, famine, disease, charity, and human rights all seem to be recognizably the building blocks of a discernible political creed, one focused on underdevelopment, the evils of global capitalism, and how the United Nations can put it all right. Meanwhile, prejudice, xenophobia, discrimination, pluralism, and equal opportunities and gender equality likewise could be the building blocks of another left-wing political creed. Now we move on to page number 257. This objection can be taken two ways. The first is that the values are wrong and should not be taught, nor serve as the basis for the framework in which citizenship is taught. Of course, only the right value should be taught, and although it is reasonable to question Toole's interpretation of this particular set of goals, any call for government inculcation of good citizenship must understand that not all governments are perfectly well informed about what good citizenship is. The second way of taking the objection is to worry that even if the values were right, it would be improper for the government to use them as the basis for teaching citizenship because they are, although right, disputed among reasonable people. Why would anyone think that the right values should not be taught to children? The view might seem outlandish, but it is not. This version of Toole's worry is closely connected, in fact, to the conception of liberal legitimacy that underlies the norm of reciprocity. Good citizens will refrain from demanding measures that they can justify only by appeal to reasons that they know other people could not accept, because they are, in some deep sense, private. The reason that this is so important is that legitimate state is able to command the consent of its reasonable citizens, a state that justified its actions on the basis of reasons that they could not accept would forfeit the right to that consent. Legitimating consent must be earned, not manufactured, even if the state in question, in some sense, deserves the consent it gets. The problem with citizenship education is that it might support the concern that the state is gaining consent in a non-legitimate way. It might be that teaching citizenship education is relevantly like slipping a consent-inducing drug into the water supply. So should states refrain from creating citizens altogether? Should they simply hope that children raised by parents, educated in the basics, and surrounded by a democratic culture will come to have sufficient commitment to the virtues of citizenship that the polity will survive? Not if there is a way of educating in the virtues of citizenship that is unlike slipping a consent-inducing drug into the water supply, and there is. Concern for legitimacy has direct implications for both pedagogy of citizenship, education, and the culture of citizenship. Whereas children should indeed be educated into the habits and virtues of good citizenship, just as they should be educated into the habits and virtues of good character, they should simultaneously be equipped with the habits of minds and cognitive skills that support reflection on those virtues and on the character of the state itself. The virtues are taught, but so is reflection on them. The character of the state is explained and justified, but it is also scrutinized, and so its justification. So we had moved on to page number 258, but on page number 257 as well, we have a box 11.5, with the subheading Expectations of all lower secondary bracket aged 11 to 14 bracket close students in France. Number 1, understand and master the vocabulary of citizenship and certain key concepts. Number 2, understand how the main French political institutions work, including executive and legislature, and the status of overseas territories. Number 3, understand the essential articles of key reference text. Number 4, understand and respect certain fundamental rules of political and societal conduct. And number 5, be capable of effective discourse in the context of formal debate. Again, moving on to page number 258. We end this topic with the box of key points. So the key points are: number 1, virtues of good citizens need to be inculcated in children through schooling. Number 2, teachers have to be educated appropriately in order to be able to do this well. Number 3, any curriculum inculcating the virtues of citizenship should be approached cautiously because there is a reasonable fear of indoctrination. Now, moving to the next topic, which is conclusion. We have seen that citizenship is far from a trivial status. Citizens are morally bound to respect one another, and states can legitimately intervene in the educational process to attempt to foster the virtues of good citizenship in its future adults. Given how demanding it is to be a good citizen, states also have an obligation to facilitate these virtues by designing democratic structures in such a way that they do not present undue barriers such as excessively complicated electoral systems to their exercise. But it is a complicated matter who is entitled to citizenship of a particular state, or even what normative rules should guide states in deciding whom to admit. The literature on citizenship is vast, partly because the topic is so central in political theory, and partly because it is an older topic than many others, reaching back to the ancient Greeks. But there is still more work to do. In the late 1980s, the concept of differentiated citizenship had barely been broached, yet since Will Kimlicka's first book, which was in 1989, that topic has seen an explosion of interest, partly thanks to his work and partly because with the collapse of Eastern Bloc, more ethnically diverse polities had to face up to their diversity. In coming decades, it is highly likely that questions about migration and the moral standing of national boundaries will attract more attention, as will the obligations of citizens in advanced advantaged nations to citizens of other countries with whom they nevertheless interact in morally important ways. Bracket through trade and their own country's foreign policy, for example. Bracket close. Similarly, as dissatisfaction with low civic participation in countries grows, more political attention will be focused on how to stimulate more active citizenship, and political theory is likely to follow with an increasing interest in the education of citizens. Moving on to page number 259, there is a case study. So, the case study has a heading of Mozart versus Hawkins County Board of Education. In 1983, the Hawkins County Board of Education in Tennessee voted to require all children in grades 1 to 8, in bracket children aged 6 to 14, bracket closed, to participate in reading classes using a series of readers published by whole publishers. The board argued that part of the curriculum would include character education in order to help develop positive values and to learn become good citizens, and that the school would aim to teach critical reading to increase the development of higher order cognitive skills that enable students to evaluate what they read and contrast the ideas presented. 14 parents found some aspects of the series of readers objectionable and requested that the children be allowed to participate in an alternative curriculum. The board refused, and a court case ensued, known as Mozart versus Hawkins. After several iterations, the Court of Appeals found against the parents, stating the refusal of the board to accommodate the parents did not create an undue burden under the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Now, before we move on, there is a box inside the case study. So the box is 11.6 under the subheading The First Amendment. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The Establishment Clause is currently understood by the Supreme Court to require that the government not collaborate with religious organizations such as churches in providing schools, although the government is allowed to fund religious schools as long as it does so with the very few strings attached to the funding. The Free Exercise Clause limits what public schools may do, both to promote and to demote religious belief. An undue burden would be created if government activity, whether through schools or otherwise, were to make it very difficult for parents to raise their children within their own faiths. Now we move on with the case study. It is worth getting a sense of what the parents objected to in the readers. The final decision provides a representative picture. In her lengthy testimony, Mrs. Frost identified passages from stories and poems used in the whole series that fell into each category. Illustrative is her first category, futuristic supernaturalism, which she defined as teaching man as God. Passages that she found offensive described Leonardo da Vinci as the human with a creative mind that came closest to the divine touch. Similarly, she felt that the passage entitled Seeing Beneath the Surface related to occult theme by describing the use of imagination as a vehicle for seeing things not discernible through our physical eyes. She interpreted a poem, Look at Anything, as presenting the idea that by using imagination, a child can become part of anything and thus understand it better. Mrs. Frost testified that it is an occult practice for children to use, moving on to page number 260, for children to use imagination beyond the limitation of scriptural authority. She testified that the story that alerted her to the problem with the reading series fell into the category of futuristic supernaturalism. Entitled A Visit to Mars, the story portrays through transfer and telepathy in such a way that it could be considered a scientific concept. According to this witness, this theme appears in the testimony of several witnesses, that is, the materials objected to could be interpreted in a manner repugnant to their religious beliefs. Mrs. Frost described objectionable passages from other categories in much the same way, describing evolution as a teaching that there is no God. She identified 24 passages that she considered to have evolution as a theme. She admitted that the textbooks contained a disclaimer that evolution is a theory, not a proven scientific fact. Nevertheless, she felt that references to evolution were so pervasive and presented in such a factual manner as to render the disclaimer meaningless. Other offensive features of the readers included a fragment of Anne Frank's diary, in in which she conjectures that unorthodox belief in God is better than no belief in God at all, and a picture showing a boy making toast for a girl in contradiction of religiously prescribed sex roles. The civic education curriculum in the Mozart case had the rather modest aim of acquainting children with a variety of perspectives on how to live in order to promote the moderate tolerance. The norm of reciprocity is, as we have seen, more ambitious and promoting. It directly might take more demanding and, to the Mozart parents, even more troubling curricular reform. If a government is aiming to produce good citizens likely to abide by the norm of reciprocity, should it welcome the Mozart decision or decisions like it? Should publicly funded and regulated schools subject all children to a rigorous curriculum that is designed to produce good citizens? Two ways of answering this question naturally suggest themselves. The first is to look at the weight that the goal of good citizenship should have relative to other important values. The Court of Appeals implicitly took this course. In the process of judicial review, it was obliged to look at the value of the right to free exercise of religion and weigh it against the goals of civic education. It found that the way in which the schools were pursuing the latter goals did not violate the former right, even though it produced some burdens for the Mozart parents. The other way of answering the question is to look at the goal of good citizenship itself and to ask how best to pursue it. Would a government determined simply to produce good deliberative citizens demand that every children in the public schools be subject to a curriculum designed specifically around that goal? Several theorists believe that Mozart case was right decided the right way, not legally, but morally. Bracket see, for example, Gutman 1995, Levinson 1999, bracket close. That is, without commenting on whether the court interpreted positive law correctly, they believe that the school was right not to accommodate the parents' wishes and that the law should endorse that policy, and this seems the obvious answer, under a certain model of how school goals should relate to public goals for education. If the model is to hold schools responsible to deliver an educational practice that is shaped completely by educational goals the society should have for children, the endorsement of Mozart seems to follow. Before accepting that model, however, it is worth pausing to contemplate the whole array of effects that the Mozart case had, bracket, insofar as we can discern them. Bracket close. After the court found against the parents, they permanently removed their children from the public schools and sent them to Christian fundamentalist schools that they had established for the purpose. When the next edition of the Readers involved was published by Holt, all of the passages to which Mozart parents had objected had been excised. Then, perhaps most damagingly of all, the story began to circulate in garbled versions among fundamentalist Christians. It joined an armory of stories about the public school, most of them grounded in, but not entirely representing the truth about the relationship between religious and public schooling, that contribute to the sense of alienation that many fundamentalist and evangelical Christians have from governmental institutions and from schooling in particular. The educational effects of schooling go beyond the effects of narrow academic curriculum and include the effects of hidden curriculum, the values, the ethos, and the composition of the school. The decision not to accommodate the Mozart parents had a composition of the school. The decision not to accommodate Mozart parents had a consequence on the composition of the public school. Bracket fewer deeply committed Christians, bracket close, and had the effect that the Mozart children ceased to have close social interactions with their mainline Protestant, Catholic, and secular classmates. In the USA, the private schools that the children entered are more or less unregulated, and there is evidence that among types of schools in the USA, private fundamentalist Christian schools are those that most reliably produce graduates who are likely to participate in political and civic life but without tolerance or deliberative virtues. On top of this, schools are not the only institutions that educate children. Families, neighborhood churches, television, organized sporting activities, billboard advertising, and numerous other features of modern societies all have educational effects, some deliberate, others advertent. The effects of schooling and of each of these other institutions depends on what are the effects of the other institutions and how children's experiences of each relate to their experiences of the others. To give a trivial but narrowly academic example, how well children learn to read in classroom depends in a complex way on how good their access to healthcare is. Children's very mild visual impairments, if they come from homes in which they have not been exposed to a wide range of reading materials, are often undiagnosed. They not only need access to prescription eyeglasses, but they also need to be diagnosed through screening. Similarly, there is evidence that high levels of commercial television watching causes depression in teenagers. which in turn inhibits academic learning and participation in friendship networks. Putting these two observations together suggests that a different model for realizing education goals. Rather than assuming that the school's curriculum should directly embody the education goals, we take an indirect approach, asking instead what overall system of school regulation would, in the circumstances, best secure those goals, taking into account at least three considerations. First, that schools are not the only institutions influencing whether these goals are met, and that the system of school provision, regulation, and funding might itself have an impact on how well other institutions, the family, civil society, contribute to those goals. Second, private schools, whether they are regulated, and how will influence how well those goals are secured. Third, schools affect one another, and decisions about what public schools should do will affect the character of private schools. What does this alternative model tell us about Mozart case? Deriving conclusive commentary on a particular case from a normative ideal is a difficult matter, especially given, moving on to page number 262, especially given in the indirect model I have proposed here. Society has the education goal of producing good citizens, capable of carrying out their duties as citizens and inclined to exercise their responsibilities in public deliberation. Policymakers committed to that goal have to make judgments about how public schools can best contribute to the goal. A policymaker who has the power to fund and regulate private as well as schools public schools may judge it wise to fund selectively schools run by religious foundations while regulating them so that they meet certain curricular and ethos standards. This is roughly the strategy that officials in the UK government have adopted in relation to funding Muslim schools. They have funded schools with an integrative ethos, the leaders of which are judged likely to take a positive lead in making the communities they serve part of the common deliberative framework of British political and cultural life. Policymakers in the USA do not have such freedom because of the way in which the courts interpret the establishment clause of the First Amendment. So they have to take the competition between unregulated private religious schools and the secular public schools as a given. Within that constraint, it may well be that accommodation of the Mozart parents would have made a better contribution to the creation of deliberative citizens than did the policy the district actually took and that the court permitted. Accommodation would almost certainly have kept the relevant children within the public schools, ensuring more likelihood of them and their schoolmates developing the cross-cultural toleration and understanding that underpins good deliberation. It would not have contributed to the alienation of the Mozart parents and the religious community to which they belonged, and would have at least delayed the time at which the Holt readers, read by millions of children, would have excised the more demanding and offensive passages to the detriment of the creation of broad thinking and tolerant citizens. Although there are good reasons for believing that the excisions would have come eventually anyway, for which see Revich 1999 close. Now the box is ended here, and there are questions which are given. So I'll read out the questions. Question number 1: are all rights individual rights? Question number 2: if the government could produce good citizens by surreptitiously slipping a good citizenship drug in the water supply, should it do so? Question number 3: Christians place God above mammon. Does this necessarily force them to be irresponsible citizens? Or good citizens but bad Christians? Close? Question mark. Question number 4: immigrants to the USA have to pass a test in order to become citizens. Americans who are born in America are automatically citizens, whether they like it or not. Is either class of people entitled to be proud to be an American? Question number 5: if you were a Hawkins County School Board official, what arguments would you have given to the Mozart parents for keeping their children in the reading program to which they objected? To what lengths would you have gone to keep them from removing their children from the school? Why? Question number 6: in order to be hired as a teacher in a state school in most of Wales, you must either speak Welsh or commit to taking Welsh classes. Are the local authorities that make this requirement justified in imposing this requirement on employment? Justify your answer. Moving on to page number 263. Question number 7. How much discretion, if any, should governments have in deciding who gets to be a citizen? Why? Be sure to consider the effects of such decisions on those who are rejected as well as those who are accepted. Question number 8. What is the difference between citizenship education and indoctrination? Question number 9. Should schools teach children to be patriotic? And question number 10. which is the last question. When you are deciding how to vote, are you obliged to deliberate about the common good, or are you entitled simply to vote for what is best for you? If you think you should balance self interest and the common good, explain how you should weigh the different considerations. And the reading ends here. We have further reading given. There are some books that are listed and some web links, and that is it.
Citizenship. The form and substance of citizenship in each historical period reflect the dominant configuration of socio-economic and political forces of each historical period. The specificity of citizenship in each historical period can be understood by seeking answers to questions like who are the citizens, who are excluded from citizenship, and what is the process basis of exclusion, what is the nature of citizenship. Is it a legal status indicating entitlements, or does it also involve active participation in political life? What kind of relationship between the individual and the religious cultural community is envisaged in the rights and responsibilities of citizenship? What are the avenues of participation towards building a responsible citizenship? Answer to such questions would give us an insight into the manner in which the notion of citizenship has evolved historically and grasp the complexities of contemporary debates. Contemporary debates on citizenship raise questions around notions of equality and rights, issues of individual, group, and community rights, active and passive citizenship, and a relationship between and relative primacy of rights and duties. What do you mean by citizenship? More often than not, citizenship is seen in terms of legal, formal status, having a specific nationality, holding a passport, and deriving from the status, entitlements, and claims, rights guaranteed by the Constitution, as well as specific duties and responsibilities which the Constitution may lay down. The idea of citizenship, however, goes beyond the legal form framework to denote substantive membership in the political community. The commonly accepted definition of citizenship by T. H. Marshall in Citizenship and Social Class 1950 as full and equal membership in a political community holds the promise of equality and integration within the political community. While citizenship may be identified with an ideal condition of equality, it may actually remain elusive and fettered as societies are always marked by hierarchies of class, caste, sex, race, and religion, rather than equality of status and belonging. Equality and integration as constitutive elements of citizenship give it, however, its unique character as a momentum concept. Citizenship internal logic that demands that its benefits necessarily become progressively more universal and egalitarian, citizenship may then be seen as a condition that is continually evolving and changing. At different moments in history, becoming a citizen has evolved either an extension of the status to more persons or a liberatory dismantling of hitherto existing structures of operation. The constituent elements of citizenship has been uncertain and often contradictory, making it difficult to outline a precise notion of citizenship. There are divergent responses, for example, to questions pertaining to whether rights or duties are the defining elements of citizenship or whether the arena of politics or state activities is its rightful domain as opposed to the spheres of culture, economy, and society. Again, there is no consensus on whether citizenship is only a status or a measure of activity, or what is of primary significance for citizenship. The autonomy of the individual or the community and the social context that shape the need of the individual. Even on questions pertaining to the legitimate unit of citizenship identity with the nation state or the global civil society, there is a lack of consensus. In order to understand why these contradictions coexist in the conceptual framework of citizenship, it is important to see them in terms of historically emergent trends. It is important, moreover, to explore these various strands in this specific historical context, keeping in mind, however, that at each historical moment the earlier strands coexisted, keeping alive the tensions and uncertainties over the form and content of citizenship. Historical development of the concept of citizenship. The word citizenship is derived from the Latin civis and its Greek equivalent politis, which means member of polis or city. The manner in which citizenship is understood today as a system of equal rights, as opposed to privileges ascribed by condition of birth, took roots in the French Revolution. With the development of capitalism and liberalism, The idea of citizenship as an individual bearing right irrespective of his or her class, race, gender, ethnicity, etc., became further entrenched. Since the 1980s, globalization and multiculturalism have provided the context within this, the notion of citizenship has been challenged. Thus, the development of ideas that surround the concept of citizenship can be attributed to four broad historical periods: A. Classical Greco Roman period, B. Late medieval and early modern period, including the period of French and American revolutions, C. The development in the 19th century corresponding to the growing influence of liberalism and capitalism, D. The contest over the form and substance of citizenship in the late 20th century, with increasing preoccupation with multiculturalism and community rights. Two dominant strands or traditions of rights and citizenship can be seen to have developed over these periods: civic republicanism, characterized by the idea of common good, public spirit, political participation, and civic virtue, and liberal citizenship with an emphasis on individual rights and private interest. The Marxist and the feminist have criticized both these traditions as exclusionary and have suggested radical changes in the theory and practice of citizenship. Similarly, cultural pluralists, radical pluralists, and civil society theorists have offered alternative ways of thinking about citizenship and rights. The classical period and civic republican citizenship, civic virtue, freedom, and active citizenship. The term civic republican denotes a constitutional government founded on principles of sharing of power to prevent arbitrary authority and the involvement of citizens in public affairs to the mutual benefit of the individual and the community. The Greek republics, or the city states Athens and Sparta, were exponents of the classical institution of citizenship that we identify with the civic republican traditions. Athens and Sparta were based on opposing political principles: Sparta on stern authoritarianism and Athens on democracy. But they were both exponents of the principle of classical citizenship as public service and civic duties. If Athens required commitment for her citizens for ready participation in governmental and judicial functions, for Sparta, a civic society involved selfless devotion of her citizen soldiers. In politics, Aristotle explicates what citizenship should ideally be and what the conditions are in which such an ideal may be realized. In the earliest form of Greek republics or city states, citizenship was an expression of an inherent centrality of the political elements in human nature and remained the primary organizing principle of human life. Greek republics like Athens and Sparta were closely knit, self-governing political communities characterized by small population and minimum social differentiation. The organization of the republic was based on familiarity and trust, principles of active political participation, the prioritization of the public and the political aspects of life, and the primacy of the identity of man as citizen. The idea of citizenship around which the city-states were organized may be seen as manifesting the conditions in which the human beings may, following the Aristotelian dictum, realize their natural slaves. In its classical formulation, therefore, as a binding force in the community and as a means by which human beings could be in touch with their true nature, citizenship emerged as a framework for securing freedom for citizens. Now, this notion of citizenship as a means as well as a state or a condition of freedom has been an enduring element of citizenship since classical times. An important element of citizenship as a means and a condition of freedom was participation in civil life. Greek citizens were described by Aristotle as all who share in the civic life of ruling and being ruled in turn. While the idea of participation in the act of ruling continues to be a significant component of active citizenship, jealously cherished by those who espouse citizenship as civil deal. In the context of classical Greece, not everyone could share in the civic life which consisted of ruling and the ruled. Citizenship was limited to those having the capacity to participate in the process of governance and was confined to free native born men, excluding women, children, slaves, and resident aliens. In the ultimate analysis, citizenship consisted only a small part of population whose participation in public life was made possible by the exclusion and subordination of the private spheres of the family and economic life, and by the existence of slaves who were responsible for performing the principal economic functions. Thus, the classical notion of citizenship, while handing down the legacy of citizenship as a realm of freedom and participation, also spelled its association with privileges and exclusion. As a free and autonomous individual, participating in making decisions that all had agreed to obey. Thus, the conception of citizenship established by the French Revolution combined the classical connotation of citizenship as a civil participation with modern liberal individualism. The revival of civic republicanism and its association with the idea of citizen as an autonomous and rational individual was due to nationalism, which was a powerful force of redefined the form of social political solidarity and paved the way for a more democratic notion of citizenship. Generally understood, nationalism refers to self definition and self consciousness of the nation or a people as a unified entity, an expression of solidarity or interconnectedness among people and recognition by others of this solidarity are integral to nationalism. In other words, nationalism involves self awareness by a people that they constitute a nation. B. The consciousness that there is something about them as a nation that make them different from other nations. C. That there is a larger imperative form which the self-definition as a nation derives. The definition of nationalism by Anthony Smith, 1983, as an ideological movement for the attainment and maintenance of self-government and independence on behalf of a group, some of whose members conceive it to constitute an actual or potential nation, like other capture the essence of nationalism, which he sums up in the phrase of ideal of independence. The aspirations for solidarity and sovereignty implies, argues Smith, that the group should be free from external interference and internal divisions to frame its own rules and set up its own constitutions and institutions in accordance with its needs and character. The group is self-determining because of its individuality gives it laws that are peculiar to it. Only the assembly of all the citizens of the community acting in concert can make laws for the community. No section, no individual, and no outsider can legislate. The 19th and the 20th century, capitalism, liberalism, and universal citizenship. With the development of capitalist market relations and the growing influence of liberalism in the 19th century, the combination of two traditions, civic republicanism and liberal individualism, proved tenuous. The idea of citizenship as individual with private and conflicting rather than a commonality of interest gradually gained precedence. A much less liberal citizenship involving a loosely committed relationship to the state, which in turn interfered as little as possible in the citizen life. The emergence of a market economy and an influential bourgeoisie was accompanied by dismantling of the existing feudal and quasi-feudal socio-economic structure that had fettered individual initiative and autonomy with their emphasis on personal subversiveness and entrenched social and economic hierarchies. The idea of citizenship that emerged in the context was characterized, according to Derek Herter, by individual rights and individual mobility across social class, made possible by ideas of equality among citizens and the replacement of a localized civil society by an all-encompassing national political community. T. H. Marshall, Equal and Universal Citizenship. T. H. Marshall, in his influential account of the growth of citizenship in England, states that the concept developed in a peculiar relationship of conflict and collusion with the capitalism. Marshall widely accepted definition of citizenship as free and equal member of a political community, come primarily from the study of citizenship as a process of expanding equality against the inequality of social class. The latter being an integral element of capitalist society. In citizenship and social class, Marshall distinguishes three strands on bundles of rights constituting citizenship, with civil, political, and social. Civil rights, defined by Marshall as rights necessary for individual freedom, include freedom of speech, movement, conscience, the right to equality before the law, and the right to own property. They were negative rights in the sense that they limit or check the exercise of government power. Political right was the right to vote, the right to stand for elections, and the right to hold public office, provide the individual with the opportunity to participate in political life. The provision of political rights required the development of universal suffrage, political equality, and democratic government. Social rights, argued Marshall, guaranteed the individual a minimum social status, provided the basis for exercise of both civil and political rights. These were positive rights to live the life of civilized being according to the standards prevailing in the society. Now, these standards of life and the social heritage of society are realized